Hello, my name is Janice Arnold, Board Development Consultant at the Manitoba School Boards Association. Welcome to the webinar on conflict of interest. The original air date of this webinar was in October 2013, and this version is being recorded without a live audience. Therefore, the questions asked by participants at the end of the original are unavailable. In a live webinar, I often present some questions that give us a quick picture and help steer the conversation. That's what this part would look like. We're now going to head on to the main presentation on conflict of interest. This is the second in a two-part series on school boards, code of conduct, and conflict of interest. Even if you missed the first session, you can get something out of this one as it is a standalone, but I encourage you to take a look at the one on codes of conduct as they are connected, which I'll point out later. The Public Schools Act is specific in its conflict of interest legislation around pecuniary or financial matters, but it's silent in other areas. In June 2012, the Manitoba government mandated implementation of Code of Conduct. Today we'll look at how, through this authority, or really a gift that the province handed school boards, these boards can broaden its policies around conflict of interest as well. And you might be asking, why do you want to broaden it? And that's part of what we'll look at today, as well as what you might want to consider if doing so. Areas causing boards concern are not so much around financial issues, which are quite specific in the legislation, but more around relationships and influence. The Public Schools Act covers basic financial conflicts, a board being asked to buy something overpriced from a trustee's business, or hiring underqualified or an overpaid family member. There are, however, some more subtle conflicts. And examples of these might be a trustee's role on another board which the division does business with, or a trustee being part of staff contract negotiations when their spouse is employed in an adjoining division. And you can say, well, that's an adjoining division, but this can be an issue because many boards are influenced by pattern bargaining. So what happens in the adjoining division can influence your own division. If a trustee is also a parent and they're asked to vote on study trips out of province, which schools, grades, or how many students can go. These are a lot of ethical shades of gray. It's all about relationships and influence. What is needed are clear policies and procedures before something arises, and not trying to hammer out a decision in the heat of the moment when the emotions are there and they come with it. Embed in your discussion of some difficult topics and embed that in regular reviews and evaluations. And have your codes and policies supported by commitment to the principles of integrity, transparency, predictability, and accountability. In the webinar on Code of Conduct, I talked about perception. One issue for your board that looks like a conflict of interest can tar you for a long time, and it not only tars the individual, but if you have policies in place and you're not willing to take action, it can tar your entire board as well as other school boards. You have to look at what is the public's perception of what's happened, and it can follow you around for a long time, including future elections. For your code of conduct, I talked about 3 parts, and it's the same for conflict of interest: creating a definition, criteria, and processes. Specifics can be part of an addendum. If reviewing your conflict of interest policies, when you are reviewing them, take a look to see that it outlines decision-making filters. What specifically is going to trigger the board into taking action under your conflict of interest policies? Does it include a process for self-declaration? And very specifically, how does that happen? And make sure it notes the procedure to challenge a charge under the policy. Aside from reviewing your conflict of interest and code of conduct policies on a regular basis, it's important as new trustees to come to your board, come to your board to have regular conversations about these issues so that the language of the policies are understood by all. Take a look at what you have in place and test it against some scenarios. If a conflict of interest policy talks about no direct or indirect pecuniary interest, where does it fall, and do your policies have language around a situation where Uncle Charlie happens to be a trustee and maybe his niece is seeking a position in the school division? This is not happening at the board table, but the consequences are still there. He doesn't stand to gain financially. However, could his promotion of her be seen as a conflict? Or is the niece to receive a letter of discipline and Uncle Charlie feels compelled to step in and ask that there only be verbal admonishment and nothing put in her file? Even if there isn't a direct reporting line, Uncle Charlie does have at least a perceived position of power over the person he's making the suggestion to. This becomes especially important in rural communities when there are a lot of close relationships or past relationships, as there are fewer people, perhaps some business relationships. So putting those things into place before something like that arises can be valuable. Start by looking at some test questions to review or develop your policies further. You may want to take note of these same questions, as they can also be used when an issue arises. And you can look at some of those test questions a little bit later, and I can provide those to you if you want to use those in a review. Here are 4 areas that we're going to go through that you can use as a specific test when you review conflict of interest policies. The first question could be, would the community accept and approve of this person's or organization's actions? With peer standards, this refers to the excuse that everybody else is doing it. Whether having board members supply services or hire family members, it should mean that there's no free pass. Otherwise, where does it stop? How far does it go before it's gone too far? Well, on a much larger scale, you may want to remember what's happening or what happened in Quebec in 2013 with the Charbonneau inquiry on corruption. While it was at a much higher level, it is relatable. The environment of corruption had become pervasive there, and it was really, well, everybody else is doing it. But it didn't start to that extent or of what it actually became. It's the same in private business. Michael Hirschman is an anti-corruption expert. He's currently working to rebuild SNC Lavalin as it tries to overcome its own corruption scandal. You may recall that SNC is a Montreal-based engineering firm that was all over the news in 2013 with allegations involving widespread bribery, and this included former Libyan dictator Gaddafi. Whether it's SNC or any number of other businesses or Quebec businesses, Hirschman called it the prisoner's dilemma. If you want to do business, even cleanly, you can't. This is on a whole different level, and there are some checks and balances for school boards, so it's not likely that it would go to that extent. It is, however, more likely to happen on an individual level as opposed to a board level. Rather than not being able to do business, what if it's that an individual cannot get a vote passed without doing a lot of back scratching first? You can see now how it relates. You do need to be careful when using this test. By applying only the peer standard, there is a danger of ignoring unethical activity simply because it's accepted in the community. You need to go further and apply this along with the next 3 tests. So let's take a look at them. So number 2, for that test, you can ask, what impact will it have on the credibility and leadership? It requires a walkthrough or discussion of possibilities, thinking of an initial action or decision and playing that out. A perceived conflict of interest can be just as damaging to an organization's or leader's reputation as an actual conflict. There are situations that can evolve over time, ballooning into something unintended. Look at poor old Uncle Charlie again. 10 years along, with a few more favors handed out, and the division might employ his whole extended family. Or that same niece might then eventually have ambitions to become principal or superintendent. So where does it stop? Another example would be if a trustee suggests to, for example, the secretary-treasurer that they engage his son's lawn service business, which at the time happens to be the only one in town, so it's not much of an issue. As time goes on, however, there can be other service providers that become available. The choice needs to be put before the board with some decision-making filters around it that also apply to the first lawn care business. Or with resource constraints, a division-wide music program has to be moved to just 2 schools, with students from neighboring schools bussed in. The logical choice is towns A and B, and that is how the majority of trustees vote, but these also happen to be the hometowns of 2 of the trustees. Without a lot of transparency, how does this play out, and also how does it affect future decisions? The point is to establish protocols in advance to protect against loss of credibility. Things like specific tender procedures and criteria or abstention from votes make this a lot easier. The question here, what would a reasonably prudent person or board do under the circumstances? This goes directly to the core of a trustee's duty of care to impartiality, to the best of their ability and knowledge, to fulfill the duties of office with the same degree of care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would show in comparable circumstances. However, this test has a little more shades of gray feel to it. What may seem reasonable to one may not to another. It is important to have those conversations regularly at your board table and review your policies. An example again could be that a restaurant used by the board offers a discount, used by the board, for example, for their evening meetings, offers a discount to the daughter of one of the trustees for her wedding. The trustee asks the board to decide if this is a conflict, and the board decides no for 2 reasons. First, the discount wasn't solicited by that trustee, and second, the board does not want to use or does not use the restaurant exclusively and routinely solicits offers from several restaurants for catering services. Having some wording in your policies to guide this would, however, show leadership and serves as a guide to all to stop and consider the question and see if the argument holds water. The last test is interesting as it deals with your principles as a trustee and your integrity. There is a requirement to act honestly and in good faith in what the trustee considers to be the best interests of the students. Trustees can feel torn between their loyalties to a particular constituency and the division as a whole. Representatives of particular constituencies have an obligation to present both the facts and perceptions on behalf of their constituents. So play devil's advocate to make sure that there is due process. But when the moment for decision arrives, it's the trustee's responsibility to cast their vote in the best interests of the students, regardless on the impact of to his or her constituents. If a trustee can't, they declare a conflict of interest and abstain from the discussion as well as the vote. Again, let's expand on this idea. If you find yourself always abstaining, then I would challenge that you are not representing your constituents. Or, if you are always on the other side of the vote, there can be several things at play here. Are you actually playing devil's advocate? Are you letting your earlier vote, a lost vote, color all future votes? Or are you just a contrarian and maybe there are some party lines emerging? Isolate what's happening and objectively ask, is there a legitimate reason that you're always abstaining or on the other side? If you can isolate and look at it objectively, then you decide. Do you stick with it and try to change from within? Do you accept that there isn't a legitimate reason for always going against and let it go? If so, you'll need to refocus on what's best and remember it's about all students. It may also be a simple matter of listening and trying to understand better the other side. Share and defend your views, but also listen to others, and then try to objectively vote, remembering to do so for the benefit of the division. Or finally, are you actually going to have to decide to step away completely? Take ownership. We've looked at this from the view of preparing in advance, but let's touch quickly on when you're in the midst of a conflict of interest. While the PSA does provide sanctions and a trustee can be removed from office, it's rare. More often, a trustee could be guilty of a lesser or more ambiguous offense, and this is where the connect comes between your code of conduct and conflict of interest. The board can have the authority to sanction the trustee under its code of conduct. As with the code of conduct, if the board has put policy in place around conflict of interest and there is a breach, failure to use it in some form can open the board to credibility issues. The board should be prepared to, as they say, use it or lose it. If the board doesn't take ownership of its own policies, and then the breach could become magnified. The board could open itself to further breaches, or the government could step in if the board is unwilling. I'd like to run through another test of sorts, or something which you may base your own decision-making filters on, if you think that you may be in conflict. Or if you don't already have specific language in board policy, you could base procedures on some of the following points. The first, public duty versus private interests. You ask, do I have personal or private interests that may conflict, or to be perceived to conflict with my public duty? Also ask, how is this going to look without open communication? Then, potentialities. Could there be benefits for me now or in the future that could cast doubt on my objectivity? I talked earlier about doing a walkthrough or a discussion of possibilities. Does it smell off? Then there's perception. Remember, perception is important. How will my involvement in the decision or action be viewed by others? Proportionality. Does my involvement in the decision appear fair and reasonable in all circumstances? This is the reasonable person test. And then presence of mind. What are the consequences if I ignore conflict of interest? What if my involvement was questioned publicly? How far does the perception stretch beyond yourself and your own school board? Will an outside authority step in to take control if your board is seen to not have control? And then promises. Have I made promises or commitments in relation to the matter? Do I stand to gain or lose from the proposed action or decision? Everything in moderation. Finally, before we go off imagining a boogeyman in every corner, and we must remember that the point is to be aware of these possible situations and be prepared and have procedures and policies to deal with them. But when questions arise, do they require sober second thought beforehand? Not everything is a conflict or breach of policy. In rural communities, as I mentioned before, this is particularly true in communities that have a limited pool of suppliers or where many people may have some type of prior relationship. Board members, by the very fact that they are part of a community, can make a valuable contribution to the division. Again, I'll use an example to illustrate. If a board member owns a computer store, the division may very well benefit from the discounts and service at her store. So it could be a mistake to prohibit working with trustees as vendors. Social, business, religious, and service clubs are often the glue that holds smaller communities together. You need to take care that conflicts of interest don't weaken the glue, yet maintain principles of fairness and transparency. One last point to think about as you review your policies. Some boards are willing to confront their issues directly, but you may find it useful to have some independent person preside. Some boards also find it useful to ease into the conversation by discussing hypothetical situations and thinking about how they would deal with it. It gives insight, helps weigh options, and it can give them, can give them constructive tools to deal with conflicts when they arise. Preparation and sound policies provide for sound management practices. When a board hasn't done its due diligence, monitored its conduct, been publicly transparent, and reviewed its practices and protocols, it risks the public questioning everything it does, resulting in loss of credibility, support for good programs, and the inability to attract qualified trustees, never mind squandering of taxpayers' money and goodwill. As part of this two-part series, I can provide some test scenarios if you want to use them in the review of your policies, or the test questions I outlined throughout this presentation. Good luck, and remember, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or put those policies in place before you need them.